Day by day, little by little, we write the story of our lives. Join author Joe Alsh on a walk down memory lane with tenacious humans who didn't let their circumstances dictate their life and what they could become. Welcome to the Lemon Tree Memoirs of Courage podcast.
Hello, welcome today to the Lemon Tree. We are so excited to have a very special guest, my friend Christy Pickering. She is the author of Courage. She's come all the way from Gulfport, Mississippi, and I want to hear about your book. Just can't wait to get started. So tell us the subject of your book. Tell the viewers.
So I wrote the book because it is my story of living in an abusive relationship for almost 2 decades. How I finally found the strength to stand, the courage to speak, and to finally walk out the door with both of my children and find my happiness.
And you know, Christy and I have been friends for over 40 years. We're about to celebrate our 40th high school reunion. And of all the girls in high school, you are the one that I would least think would ever be in a violent relationship. And your book is so incredible. I've read it 2 or 3 times. I could not put it down. It's a very fast read, but tells such a story. So why did you decide to tell this such a personal story and share this story?
For 3 reasons, actually, and it wasn't easy to begin telling this story because I had kept it hidden behind my 4 walls for many years. I didn't want anyone to see me as weak. So it was kind of tough in my community as a businesswoman to admit that I had allowed myself to live in an abusive relationship. But the 3 reasons that I started talking about it is first because it was healing for me. I was now out and happy, and yet I needed to do the final thing, which was to write it down and put it on paper and admit it. So that was first. And second, I found as I spoke to people about my story that it helped them share theirs because I was a safe place to share. So that was the second reason that I decided I needed to write the book, because I couldn't give enough to an audience in an hour. I couldn't really leave them with everything I needed to leave them with that I had learned. And so the third reason that I speak to young women, mostly in universities, is because that's when I made my biggest mistakes. I picked the wrong guy. Mm-hmm. And I want them to know what the signs are. I want them to not step in the potholes I stepped in and not make my mistakes.
Well, and every girl, when they get married, wants to live happily ever after.
Absolutely.
And so you do want to make those right choices. And just the little signs that you saw. So let's start. Your ex-husband's name is Paul. So we're going to talk about Paul. How did you meet him?
Okay, and first of all, his name's not Paul, but I call him Paul because it's really not about dogging him.
Right.
You know.
Right.
But I call him Paul in the book. I met him in college. I was asked to be a little sister for a fraternity, his fraternity. So I became a little sister for his fraternity, and a couple years later we started dating, and that's how I met him in college. Mm-hmm. So.
And were there signs of abuse when you were dating in college?
Okay, there were signs of a temper, but not really abuse. Mm-hmm. So only a couple times. Mm-hmm. One time, the first time we were studying in his room. The door was open. We're at the fraternity house and we're studying, and he was very frustrated. And he became very demonstrative, started cussing, tore up his book and his notebook, threw them in the hall. And I had never seen that. I'd never grown up with that kind of thing. And I just didn't know what to do. And I just left. He didn't aim it at me, to be honest, but it was just so over the top. I had never seen that. So that was a sign.
And did he give an explanation or excuse for his behavior that day?
He didn't that day. That evening he called me and he said he was sorry and that he shouldn't have done that and that, he just was frustrated. Mm-hmm. That was his excuse.
And I know in the book you talk about he'd walk you to class and wait for you to get out of class. And that is so sweet. I could see as a young girl thinking, oh, that's really, really a sweet thing to do. So looking back, when did you see that first sign that something was wrong with Paul?
Well, I don't think I really started pinpointing it till after we got married, but there were a couple of things that happened when we were dating, but as I looked back, I saw that, as you said, he would walk me to class or drive me to class and be waiting for me after every class, and I thought it was just because he loved me and cared about me, and I'm not saying that men don't do that for that reason, but as I got more information and that information built up, I realized that he was controlling my moves, and so at first year of our marriage, I started seeing some signs.
And so you've been married for 21 years. So you dealt with domestic violence for 21 years. How did you stay so long?
Well, first of all, I was so young and naive. When I was in high school, which you knew me in high school, I didn't date a whole lot. So I didn't have a whole lot of experience. And I grew up in this wonderful family, loving family. We didn't fight, we didn't fuss, hardly ever. And so I didn't know how to deal with conflict. So when it started happening in my marriage, I just didn't know how to handle it. And I was really, I'm a more assertive kind of woman now that I've gone through all of this. But back then I was very submissive. And so I just kind of did what he said. He
went along to get along.
And just did what he said, kept the peace and stayed in it. But things escalated over the years, and it just got worse and worse.
So what was the first big event that took place?
So we were married. We moved to Dallas. We were living in Dallas, and we went on a bike. It was one Sunday, and we went on a bike ride. I was riding his bike, his 10-speed, and he was jogging along beside me. He was very physically fit, and we're exercising, and I went to change the gear, and the chain came off, and he just went off, started screaming and yelling at me in the middle of the street, and made me put the chain back on. I couldn't do it. So then he kept screaming at me. He made me carry the bike all the way back to the apartment, and I just didn't know what had happened. And that was the first sign of his total rage.
And I know in the book he scolded you all the way home and
Yes.
cursed at you and belittled you. How long were you married when that happened?
That was the first year of our marriage. So the honeymoon was over pretty quickly.
Wow. I'm so sorry. When I hear this story, it's just so surprising. It's so shocking. And you're so beautiful and classy and smart, and I just can't imagine you having to deal with that. So you have 2 children.
I do.
And were your children abused by their father?
They were not physically abused, but they were verbally and to some extent psychologically, at least my daughter. My daughter was afraid of him because when he would get mad, he was so big and scary. Although he never physically abused her, but he scared her. And I didn't realize how afraid of him she was until I left.
Did she see him hit you? Did your son see him hit you?
They never saw that, and he didn't start physically abusing me until the last couple years in the marriage. But the very last thing they saw was him holding a knife at my throat in the kitchen, and my son was going to get the gun because he thought his father was going to kill me. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back.
Point.
Yeah.
And how are your children today?
They're great. I left just in time. And that's really what pushed me out the door. It was not so much for me, it was for them, because I started to see my daughter's fear, and I started to see that my son was turning into him. He was picking up his father's traits and characteristics, belittling his sister. Sometimes he would pop his sister, and I was like, oh no, I can't let him ruin his life. And that's what pushed me out the door. He was 16 years old. And thank goodness I left when I did, because he's great. He is a wonderful father to 2 children, has a happy marriage. My daughter is fine and happy and healthy. So they're both really doing well.
Well, and just little children in a home environment like that, they're little sponges. And people think they're hiding things. Parents think they're hiding things from their children, but the children know, they pick up. And I'm so glad that they're doing great. So there are different types of abuse, Christy. We all know that. There's sexual, there's physical, there's emotional. Tell me the types of abuse that you suffered.
Unfortunately, all of them. Verbal, psychological, financial. And what I didn't even know about was financial abuse, which means I made all the money, but I wasn't allowed to spend it. But that's financial abuse. Or if you're taken away from the funds and you have no access to funds, that's financial abuse. So that as well, physical abuse and sexual abuse. All of them, unfortunately.
I'm so sorry. And do you feel, I know people think that physical abuse is the worst type of abuse. I don't agree with that. You tell me what your thoughts are on that. Talking about physical.
I agree with what you're saying. Most people think, if you're not getting hit, and I actually, when I was in it, until he started hitting me, I didn't even call it abuse. I didn't know that verbal abuse was abuse, but it really is. And the thing is, with verbal abuse or psychological abuse, you have no scars. You have no wounds. So you can't show anybody. And narcissists, abusers, are narcissistic, most of them. And they, outside of your four walls, everybody thinks they're wonderful because they put on that face outside of the home. So no one would have believed me if I'd said that my ex-husband was horrible to me because I didn't have any signs.
So all your friends and family thought you just had this great marriage?
Yes.
Wow. And why do you think abusers do what they do?
Because most of them are narcissists. I read a book that really helped me. Lundy Bancroft is a man who has worked his whole life studying abusers. Not because he thinks he can change them, but because he wanted to know why they do what they do. And he wanted to be able to help women see the signs. So he wrote this book, and it splits it up between here's what controlling looks like, here's what physical abuse looks like, here's what verbal abuse looks like. And some abusers have some of them have all of them, or some of them have just pieces. They use different tactics. But he said in the book, they do what they do because most of them are narcissists, and it gets them what they want, when they want it, and how they want it. And because they are such narcissists, which means they are the most important thing in the world, and they can forgive themselves for the abuses that they give to others. They can forgive themselves for what they do because it gets them what they want. And that's the most important thing to them, unfortunately. And that was the hardest thing. When I was going through my divorce, when I realized he never really loved me. I stayed because I had made a vow. I had made a vow before God and others, and so I'm a Christian woman. I wanted to stay because I'd made a vow. But what I didn't realize is that he broke it first. He never loved, honored, and cherished me. So he broke it first.
So what's the name of that book?
It's called Why Does He Do That?
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, and so what does he say? I've heard that narcissists, that if you want them to change, you would have to go back to their toddler years and reparent them. The odds of having a narcissist change. I don't know what the book says about that, but it helped me understand because I had narcissistic, elders in my life. And, and I felt like I could never do anything right. So is there a way that, does this author say, can you change them?
No, and most therapists will tell you the same thing. They say that most abusers are narcissists, and they will rarely change. Now, it doesn't mean they will never change. Sometimes they can have a miraculous change of heart, and change their life, but most of them will never, ever change. And he knew that, and he says that in his book, that it's just very, very rare. It can happen, but it's rare.
Wow. So you describe in your book what it feels like to live with an abusive partner and how debilitating that can be. You use an analogy that's very good description of what it feels like. Share that analogy with us today.
And it's a very strange analogy, but I think this describes it. When you're in a home, the thing is, an abuser doesn't abuse you every day. That it comes sometimes rarely. You just never know when it's going to come. And so it makes you behave differently because you are walking on eggshells. So the description I use in the book is, it would be like if I came home from a soccer game with my kids, and one of my children throws a soccer ball across the room and it hits the floor, and a landmine goes off inside your home, of all crazy things. And there's shrapnel and people get harmed, but no one's killed, but they're harmed. Okay, and then if in this analogy you knew you had to live in that home even though there were landmines all over your house, then would that change you? Absolutely. It would change the way you walk around that house. It would change the way you behave, right? So if the landmine is your husband, you know, and your house is your marriage. You see the analogy. You feel like you just change. Your whole persona changes. And I changed over time.
So what would you tell, I know you speak to young girls, and you call it your personal philanthropy.
Yes.
It's amazing. You speak to girls college age, high school. Tell me, what would you tell them when they're dating? What are some signs? Every girl in high school likes the bad boy. I don't know what it is, or most girls like the bad boy, the challenging one. But tell me, what are some signs that you share with young girls how not to wind up? You never planned to be in a relationship, an abusive marriage.
No.
You never planned to expose your children to that. So what are some things that the listeners can take away? What are some signs to protect ourselves as women?
Sure, and there was a great Dear Abby article years ago that has 15 signs, and I won't go through all of them, but just a few would be, they start off with controlling, like I said earlier. They become jealous, very, they try to separate you from your friends over time and your family because that's your support system, and if they can separate you, then they have more control, and then you have no one to turn to. And it just escalates. But, so there are 15 signs, but that's just a couple of them that you can see in the very beginning. And you need to pay attention to it and see if that really is them just being sweet and kind, or are they being controlling? Do they want to know where you are at all times, who you're with? Do they kind of stalk you, even though they're not, visibly stalking you? Are they stalking you by looking on your phone? That's not appropriate, but that's how they start. They get really, and they look for a quick commitment. They want you to commit very quickly to the relationship.
So how was Paul's relationship with your parents?
It was good because he was always so, they knew after a while that he was trying to separate me from him. But this was about 10 years in that they started to see that whenever we'd have a family function, he'd make us leave early. We were always the first ones to leave, and we wouldn't stay long like everybody did. So that was part of it. But in the beginning, he was just very charming and very, he was working hard to make sure he was liked and well thought of by the family. And he had his good moments. He did, but he could turn on the charm when he wanted to.
And your parents, your siblings, I know when you left, you moved in with your sister.
I did.
So tell us about that.
Well,
what gave you the courage?
Oh, yeah. The day I left was very scary because he had told me 10 years before I left him he would kill me if I left him. And I believed him.
Wow.
And he also said I would never get the children. And the reason when we would have a fight, because as things escalated, I got stronger. And then I began, I was now in my 40s, and I began speaking up for myself. And then that's when it really escalated, when I would speak back and I wouldn't let him push me. But I was really scared that he would come after me, because he had said he'd kill me, and I really believed it. So I was trying to find an apartment. I didn't want to go to my sister's house. I didn't want to go to anybody's house that I knew, because if he came after me with a gun, I didn't want anybody else to die. So it was very scary. I knew the sheriff because I'd helped him get elected. I was his treasurer for his campaign. I knew the chief of police because he was my client. So I called them both and said, look, if you get a call from my number, it's serious. I'm leaving my husband. He said he'd kill me, so take it seriously. So I called my sister and I said, I have nowhere to go and I don't know what to do. I couldn't find an apartment that was safe enough, that had enough security.
So was your sister aware until then that something was going on?
She was not. She really,
Wow.
She knew that there were some signs, but I hadn't told her about the knife at the throat and the things that had happened in in about 6 months, the last 6 months, things really escalated.
But people would read your book and say, why? You're from this wonderful family. Why didn't you reach out to your mom or dad or brother? So explain to the audience, why wouldn't you reach out? And, you hear stories of people in the news, they go to the police and say, this has been happening for 5 years, but there's nothing documented. And so tell us, why didn't you go to somebody prior to that knife incident?
A couple of reasons. First of all, I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed to tell people that I made a bad decision and that I'd stayed so long. That was A. Also, I didn't want to tell my family or my friends until I was ready to go, because I didn't want the pressure until I knew I had made the decision. And I knew my son, he was 16. He knew we were not getting along, and he saw things escalating. And every time we'd have a fight, he would later on get me alone and say, "Mama, please don't leave Dad. Don't leave Dad. I don't want you to leave Dad. I don't want to have divorced parents." So
Wow.
for him, I didn't want to leave, but I knew when he started showing signs, I was like, no, I can't stay. He's got to learn a different way. He's got to see a better relationship. So I finally left.
Well, and just how it to the audience, to someone that is in abusive relationship, they're watching this, they know they need to leave. What is a good starter conversation with the children?
Well, to be honest, I think you have to tell them exactly what's happening. Mm-hmm. I think you have to be honest with them. And you think that children, here's what I would tell people. You think you're hiding all the bad things from them,
No.
but you're not. Mm-mm. They're smart. And even though it's happening behind your closed bedroom doors, they hear it. Mm-hmm. And they know, and they see that you're changing. Mm-hmm. They see you changing. They know you're changing. You tell them that you're unhappy and that you're not trying to dog their father or their mother, whoever the abuser is, because it can happen both ways. But it's just not a healthy environment. And what I told my children is, and especially my son, my daughter was happy I was leaving, actually, but my son was not. On the day we left, he really was mad at me. And I said, one day you'll understand. Mm-hmm. And he does now. But my daughter, I have to tell this quick story. The day I was leaving, I got in the car to leave, and my son was following us in his car, going to my sister's house. And we're driving, and I start crying, tearing up. And my daughter looks at me, 10 years old. And she looks at me, and she said, "Mama, why are you crying?" And I said, "Well, darling, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing." And she said, "Mom, look." She said, "My brother's not going to grow up and be like Dad." She said, "I'm not going to marry somebody like Dad, and you'll be happy. What's wrong with that?"
Wow.
I thought, that's either God or a smart little girl, maybe both. But
I think that was the Lord saying,
I do too.
Christy, you need to be out of here.
Right.
I think that was that. So tell me, let's talk about the picture on the cover of your book. It depicts you and two children walking out the door. And talk about that day.
It was just so scary. It really was. And I drove to my sister's house, scared to death that he would come after me with a gun and that he would hurt. I was really more worried about my kids and them than I was worried about me, because I knew I had made this decision, but they didn't make that decision. So I was afraid they would be hurt. And I stayed there for 3 months before we could get back in the house. And so I scared them to death, because every time someone would leave, I was checking the doors and checking the windows and make sure they were locked.
So how long before Paul knew that you were at your sister's?
He knew that night when he came home. What I had done is, I knew I was going to leave him, but I knew I had to be careful because I didn't want him to snap. So the weekend before, I had taken all the cash and had split it 50-50, put mine in a new account, and I was so afraid he'd find that out before I actually left. And then I did that the day before, and the day I left, I wrote him, the night before, I got up in the middle of the night and I wrote him a note, and I hid it, and when I left, when he went to work, I put it out and he read it when he came home, and it said I wanted a 6-month separation. I wanted him to have time to digest the fact that this was happening. And I knew I wasn't going back, because I knew the statistics, that if I went back, he could really escalate if I tried to leave again. And he never would let me leave before with the children. So I had to do it when he didn't know.
Well, and even writing that letter, instead of saying, I'm out, I want a divorce, you even walked on eggshells with that letter, because you were worried about how he was going to respond.
Absolutely.
So you were terrified.
Yes, I was.
How did living in a relationship like this, we've talked about your book, it's so amazing, and you have a wonderful life, a wonderful marriage. Your kids are doing great. You speak all over the country. How did this change you, living in a life like that? How did that change you?
I became someone I didn't like me. I was giving up on my dreams, the things I wanted to do. He was very envious of my success. And he actually worked for me for a while. And he was just very envious of that. And so I didn't reach for those goals. I didn't go as far as I wanted to because he was jealous. I served on this public company board, and every month when I'd come home from my board meeting, I'd have to go through this whole, hour-long questioning thing about when was he going to get on the board? When was I going to get him on the board? So and I also became a different person. I used to love to sing when I was cleaning the house, and I stopped singing. I changed my personality. And when I went through the divorce, my friends would come up to me and they'd say, "Christy, you're so happy now."
Aww.
And I thought I was hiding all that, but I wasn't, obviously.
That's amazing. So you remarried. Did you ever think you would find true love?
No, I didn't. That was the hardest thing about going through the divorce. I would sit on my porch and drink wine and cry because I thought I had given up all my good years to somebody who never really loved me. And I was 43 years old, and I thought, who's going to have me? And I'll never do this again. And luckily, 7 months into the divorce, I met Brent. And he's just the most wonderful thing. We fell in love over one weekend. It was just fabulous. So, yes, I'm very happy. We've been married 13 years.
That's awesome. And does he support the book? Does he just support what you're doing and talking to others about the domestic abuse?
He does. He really does. And he even comes to the speeches with me, and he comes out at the end and says hello to the audience and my happily ever after. But he's the one who really pushed me to write the book. He kept saying, "You need to write the book. You need to write the book."
That's awesome.
Yeah,
that's awesome. And tell me, I know you've been speaking, and give me some examples of how lives have been impacted by courage.
Every time I speak, there are at least a handful to sometimes 10 or 15 waiting to talk to me, to tell me their story. And I know I've touched lives. I know there have been people that I've helped get away from abusers. I know that I've helped people share their story, people that were afraid to speak out, and now they're speaking out, and that's healing. Mm-hmm. It really is. And the thing is, it's like pay it forward. If I encourage other people to speak, then what does that do? Then they'll speak to others, and those people will speak. So the healing starts.
And there's so much healing in writing it down. You hear about journaling, and you kind of roll your eyes. Oh, yeah. But there is something so therapeutic about getting it on paper. And I've even heard studies that handwriting is even better than typing on Word or whatever, but just handwriting, getting those thoughts to paper. And, sometimes reading back on what you've written, like, wow, I have really gone through a lot, and look how I've come out on the other end. I've
Absolutely.
Survived.
Well, the way this started actually was when I was going through my divorce. My attorney said, because in Mississippi, I had to have a reason for getting the divorce. And he wouldn't agree to irreconcilable differences, so I had to show the pattern of abuse.
Wow.
So my attorney said, start writing a journal. So I did. And so the book really started. When I started the book, I went back and read that journal from years before when I'd gone through the divorce.
Wow.
And you're right, handwriting was very healing.
Well, and for me, for the lemon tree, I was asked to give my story for a group of women, a Bible study, and I'd never done anything like that before. So I did kind of a synopsis, and several women came after I spoke and said, "You really need to turn this into a book. This is a wonderful story." So it's interesting how just writing, taking the time to write, take 30 minutes a day to write your thoughts, and you never know what the end result is going to be.
Exactly. And Joe, and people are encouraged by the fact that you went through something and you persevered and you came out on the other end and you're happy and healthy. Mm-hmm. We're showing people that, yes, everybody's got something, but like Lucy, Mary, and Roberts used to say, but you can persevere and then help others.
Mm-hmm. And I say every episode, we all have a purpose. And your purpose is to help others survive, to help people see the warning signs and get out before it's too late. We talk about women being victims of abuse. You told me on the way over here about a gentleman that was in one of your audience members. Tell us about that.
Okay. And I try to talk about abuse not in a gender. I try not to do that. Now, male or female abuse is more prevalent, but it was amazing. I was giving this speech in Mississippi, northern Mississippi, and at the end, this gentleman came up, African-American gentleman came up, and about my age, our age, and he said, I want to thank you for the way you describe abuse. He said, because you don't say he did this, he did this, he did this. He said, abuse can happen either way. It can happen to children, animals. It just, unfortunately, it doesn't discriminate.
Right.
He said, but I want you to know, he said, everything that you described, I lived as well. And I said, wow. And I found out afterwards he was the director of victim services at his police department.
That's wonderful. Yeah. And imagine what he's doing to help others.
Exactly.
That's wonderful. Okay, if you could leave us with a couple of things you've learned from your experience, what would they be? Okay.
The main thing that I'm telling young women is that, first of all, you can't change someone who doesn't want to change, period. Mm-hmm. They have to want it in here first. And no matter how much you want it, you can spend your life. I spent many years praying that he would change. I'd say, God, change him or change me, but somehow change the situation. But you can't change someone who doesn't want to change. They have to want it first. And if they are not going to change, then you do not have to stay. It's not that I'm advocating divorce, but you deserve happiness. So that's one thing, and happiness is in here. And you can't find happy if you stay with unhappy. I certainly found that out because I found my happiness.
And tell me, with my book too, it's a lot about forgiveness at the end, and I learned to forgive my parents.
Sure.
So do you forgive Paul?
Absolutely. I am not mad at him. I'm not upset with him. I certainly didn't write this book to bash him. I wrote this book to help young women, and that's why I don't say his name. I've never said my married name, my former married name, and I won't. It's not to hurt him. I've forgiven him. That's healing.
Okay, tell us your website. Where can somebody go to if they would like to have you speak or they'd like to get a copy of your book? So tell us how we can get to this awesome book.
Okay, first of all, the book's on Amazon, but there is a place you can go on my website and click and order the book. It's www.girlyoudeservebetter.com.
Okay.
So that's the name of my messages, or Girl, You Deserve Better.
Okay.
Not because I'm speaking just to women, it's because I was the girl that deserved better.
You do. And I'm so glad you're happy now, and
Thank
it's
you,
a
Jen.
happy ending, and I wish you all the success of your book. Get it, read it. It's awesome. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us on the Lemon Tree Memoirs of Courage podcast, hosted by author Joe Alsh. You can find more information on Joe's beginnings and the Lemon Tree at thelemontreebook.com.